First of all, again, to everyone, namaste. It's wonderful seeing all of you there in Croatia. And before we begin with your indulgence and your patience, I would like to begin my short talk with first just a little bit of a prayer in Sanskrit, and this is the famous Brahma Gayatri mantra. If you know the Gayatri mantra, please feel free to follow along. If you don't, then please don't worry about it. If you want, you can just close your eyes and just listen to the transcendental sound vibration of this wonderful mantra as I recite it. And I will say it just once and then we will begin. Om Bhurbhuva Swaha Tat Saviturvaranyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yona Prachodhayatam. Jaya Shriman Narayana, Jaya Bhagavan Shri Krishna, Jaya Prabhupada, Jai Gurudeva. Om Hari Om. Very good. Well, again, welcome everyone. Croatian is not my first or second or third language, but hopefully I pronounced your name correctly. Thank you also. I don't know where you're holding this, but I assume it's maybe in your home. But in any case, I know that you have been supporters for a very long time, for quite a few years. And I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for your support over the years, for your moral support more than anything. This teaching mission that I have been engaging in is a mission that I have been doing for a very long time, since approximately 1988 or so. And it's something in which, regardless of whatever talent or speaking ability I may have personally, without the support and the assistance of so many hundreds and thousands of other people throughout the world, there would be nothing that I would be able to accomplish. And that's true for any individual who has any sort of vision or mission to make the world a better place. It's never one person. It's that one person who maybe has the vision, but then many, many thousands of wonderful individuals who also help to bring that vision about. So again, thank you so much. What I'm going to be talking about today is Prabhupada's vision for the coming golden age. And let me explain why I chose that title. For those individuals who do not know who this great guru was and is, Prabhupada, you will, after this talk is over, you will understand who he is and why I have chosen to make this talk in a way about him, kind of indirectly. Prabhupada served as the center, really, the catalyst for a spiritual revival that is happening throughout the world today. And very specifically, what he talked about, among other things, was how we are about to enter a new mini golden age. And this is what I'm going to be speaking about today, but not entirely. We will lead up to that after a short time. First, I want to talk a little bit about where we find ourselves today as a world, as a planet. And where do we find ourselves? Well, we find ourselves at a time in history where our culture, our vision, our values, our purpose, our worldview is something today that is very different from what it was previously, what it was in the past, for many tens of thousands of years, up until quite recently, actually. It's interesting that when you look at the world had a certain type of, let's say, ideological, philosophical, spiritual stability to it for a very long time, where there were certain ideas, there were certain ways of living, ways of being, that were understood to simply be the norm. And they were the norm because, very simply, they created happiness. They created meaning in life. This was the case for a very, very long time, where if you look at previous cultures, and when I say previous, I'm talking about certainly pre-modern, I'm talking about pre-Enlightenment era, I'm talking about the world as it was when, at least nominally, at least in the idea, God and spirituality, the idea of a transcendent, the idea of living for a purpose beyond just ourselves, was the norm. So in the past, this was indeed the case, where the idea in pretty much every society on earth, whether we talk about grand civilizations, whether we talk about small tribes, and everything in between, the general idea is that individuals should live for something greater than just me, than just my immediate needs, than just my immediate need to have information and pick up my phone and play on my phone and become a famous celebrity on Facebook and things like this. The idea at one time was that, yes, we had to have a transcendent purpose if our life were to have meaning. Now, the thing is, of course, given all these diversities of previous cultures, they weren't all necessarily perfect. They had different ideas of what that higher purpose was, of what God was, what the transcendent was, what spirituality was. But at the very least, people had purpose. People had meaning in their lives. Well, what do we see today? What we see today, and especially for those of us who are a little bit older, thus we could see this rapid progression of purposelessness and meaninglessness in the lives of so many people. What we have seen is that today we live in a culture, in a modern culture, in modernity, a secular modernity, in which real purpose and personal meaning is gone. And this is pretty much the case for most individuals. Sadly, even for individuals for whom they think that's not the case for them. Very often, individuals may think that they're idealistic, and even then, truthfully, it's a self-centered sort of idealism. It isn't what I was describing before, this idea of there being a purpose outside of just my own needs and interests and desires and pleasure, etc. What we find is that we have indeed created now a global society in which certainly God is gone, but spirituality also, in the meaningful sense, is also no longer present as the center of society. The idea of a transcendent, the idea of thinking long-term, the idea of an eternal. Rather, what are the values of society today? The immediate. And not just the immediate, but again, focused almost exclusively on self, on the idea of me and my interests alone. Now, the thing is, everyone knows this. I'm not saying anything in the least bit controversial. Everybody knows this. And it almost doesn't even matter what your belief system is. It doesn't matter what your religion is. It doesn't matter even if you're an atheist, if you're spiritual. It doesn't matter if you're left-wing, right-wing. It doesn't matter if you're liberal, conservative. Pretty much everyone understands this, that we have indeed created, sadly, a nihilistic sort of culture today. Now, what is the result of all this? Practically speaking, the result is what we see around us, among our friends, our family, and not everyone is experiencing this necessarily, but we all, at the very least, know someone who is. And what am I talking about? What we have seen today is that people are suffering from more pain, more actual suffering, more trauma, more depression, more, again, sense of meaninglessness and nihilism. That, oh, life is just meaningless. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. See, this is the mantra today. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what I believe. Doesn't matter what I do. Nothing matters. What we've seen is that this has become the prevalent mindset of individuals today. And what is another, let's say, name for this? Suffering. People are indeed suffering today. And when I say suffering, certainly externally, certainly health-wise, people are suffering today. But what I'm talking about more than anything is internally. Internally, emotionally, mentally. One could even say spiritually. People are suffering today because they indeed are living within this great, vast, empty vacuum where, again, God has been taken away from us. Spirituality has been taken away from us. And when individuals find themselves in such a vacuum, again, they suffer. They're depressed. What is the wonderful thing, because so far this has been a little bit negative. We have to deal with the negative first before we can then go on to the positive. We have to assess, you see, where we are if we are to then know where we should be, and then what to speak of, how to get to where we should be. But let's not deal just with what we all know, and that is the negative state of our world today. And sadly, it's been growing exponentially, this negative state of the world today, within the context of the Kali Yuga. What is wonderful is that, again, people understand this now. See, what's interesting is, if you had gone back, let's say 25 years ago or something like that, you would have found less people who, if I had said these things to, you would have found maybe less people who would have agreed. Let's say during the 90s, for example, when things seemed a little bit better. And you're in Croatia now, which was at one time part of Yugoslavia, which was at one time behind the so-called Iron Curtain. And I know Yugoslavia has a very different history from the rest of Eastern Europe, but still, you understand that in the 1990s, it seemed like, for many people, a time of great hope, a time of great promise. As the Iron Curtain broke down, as the internet was born, etc., etc., it seemed like, people are just going to become happier and happier now, and there's going to be more prosperity. Instead, of course, what we have seen has been the opposite. We have seen a continuing degeneration in culture. We have seen, again, more depression now than even 25 years ago. So for those of us who are a little bit older, like for myself, I'm in my 50s, so we can especially see this downward trajectory. But again, this is the positive thing. Today, everybody recognizes this. There's nobody, I have not found anyone who I can explain this to them, that, yes, now in modernity, people are nihilistic, people are unhappy, people need spirituality. I have not found anyone who would disagree with this today. And this is the thing that's wonderful, is that in itself shows precisely the fact that there is a great awakening that is happening. That people are finally starting to realize, they're asking themselves, what have we been doing as a culture, as a society? Whether it's in Croatia, or in America, or Canada, or Germany, or UK, or any place on earth, people are finally starting to ask this question. Where have we gone so wrong? And why have we gone so wrong for so long? And people are beginning to awaken. People are beginning finally to seek real alternatives to this culture of meaninglessness that we now find ourselves in. So this is the positive thing. What we are beginning to see very slowly, but surely, and actually growing very rapidly now, what we are beginning to see is that there is now a yearning for a deep life again. There is yearning for a deep life. You see, this is the thing. This has been the hallmark of the, let's say, much of the late 20th century, very early part of the 21st century. People have been shallow. Culture is shallow. Spirituality has been shallow. Everything has been shallow. Instead, what do we see now? People are yearning for depth. People are yearning for authenticity in everything that they do. People want the real. They don't want the artificial. They don't want to be told by a compromised media, by compromised, corrupt politicians. They don't want to be told that, yes, this is your reality. People want true reality, not just an artificial reality. So what we see is that indeed people are now turning once again to spirituality, and real spirituality, authentic spirituality. I won't go very in depth in this talk into what is authentic versus fraudulent spirituality, because I've already given several talks about this and they're available as YouTube videos where I go very in depth. But let me just say, yes, up until recently, even spirituality, unfortunately, has been rather shallow, self-centered. What can spirituality, so-called, what can it do for me? People don't want this anymore. People don't want fluffy answers that kind of give them a little bit of relief, a little bit of a feel-good sort of emotion. People want true authenticity today. I personally, let me tell you, I have been in the center of all this as a witness. I have experienced now hundreds and thousands of individuals who truly want authenticity in their life, not shallow answers. I have people who now in the last year or so have been coming to me and they will literally say to me, Acharyaji, this is what I've been searching for and this is what I need. I want the truth. I don't want to just feel good. I don't want someone to tell me something in the form of some sort of spirituality that just sounds nice, but it's not real. It's not true. It's not based on something that is eternal, that is truly philosophical. I want the truth, no matter what. This is what people are telling me now. And this in itself is a hallmark that, yes, there is a great awakening that's happening. So we are in a very important, very special place now in history. Now, the center of all this is indeed what is called Sanatana Dharma. Because again, you remember how previously I was talking about how, at one time, regardless of the culture that you looked at, regardless of the civilization, the nation, the tribe, hundreds and thousands of years ago, spirituality was the center of all things. Seeking, again, the authentic, the real, was the center of almost every culture on earth at one time. And as a result, the people of those various nations, tribes, groups, etc., they all had some form of purpose and meaning in their lives. Well, if you go back far enough, the central motif, the central philosophical spiritual motif of all these truly ancient cultures is what we call Sanatana Dharma, which is something that transcends sectarianism. As Prabhupada always said, we're not simply sectarian-oriented. It's something that transcends denominationalism. Rather, Sanatana Dharma, as I've translated it, which I feel is the most accurate translation, is the eternal natural way. Following the natural way, following the natural law that was set in place by God Himself in order to help us have meaning in our lives, have value and virtue in our lives as living beings, to live in accordance with nature's principles, and to come eventually to know God Himself personally and intimately through devotion. This is what is known as Sanatana Dharma. And this was the spiritual foundation of all past ancient civilizations, and as a result, it shouldn't be surprising to people that with this new global restoration of meaning and purpose and spirituality that is happening in the world today, it is indeed Sanatana Dharma that is the tip of the spear. It is Sanatana Dharma, more than anything, that is at the very forefront of bringing about this new restoration of spirituality to our world today. So, before I go on, I want to pause there for a second and explain what is meant by Sanatana Dharma and why this is indeed the case, that what is bringing about this new spiritual, one could say global spiritual revolution in the world, that it is indeed Sanatana Dharma. Well, first, what is Sanatana Dharma? And I'll talk about this very, very briefly, because again, we have over 100 videos where I talk about what is Sanatana Dharma in various aspects, very, very in-depth. So I don't want to take up too much of people's time when you can just watch those videos or read our books. But there are several elements that I want to talk about. First of all, there is the concept of Dharma itself. The concept of Dharma, interestingly, is the most important philosophical concept in the history of humanity. And it's amazing how people lost sight of this fact. And it's only been recently, in the last, maybe several years, that now people are finally beginning to use this word again. It's because of, honestly, a campaign that I personally started around 1988 to explain to people exactly what is meant by this very ancient term that they had forgotten. Interestingly, even in the Vedic and Hindu world, even though this word dharma is central to our principles, it's a word that was very much neglected up until recently, until I personally began this teaching campaign around 1988, where I began to explain that if you're Vedic, you must understand what is meant by dharma. It's not just some side idea. Rather, dharma is central to our understanding of the world. And this essentially is what dharma means in the smallest nutshell. That again, when we look at nature, when I say when we look at nature, I don't mean merely when we quite literally see nature through our eyes and through our empirical senses. I'm not talking about simply going into nature and looking at the trees. I'm talking about something subtler than this, more meaningful than this. And that is when we allow that which is behind the empirical fact of nature to speak to our soul and to speak to our rational mind. What do we see? We see that nature itself is ordered. That nature itself, even though, again, to the physical eye, sometimes it can seem a little bit chaotic. Oh, a tree grows there, something grows there, various things happen in the universe. What we see is that actually there's principle behind everything. There are laws of nature that are there that govern not just the physical aspect of nature, not just physics, but metaphysics, that also govern us as well. There are inherent laws, principles that are there in nature, which if we understand them, and if we ourselves try to apply them to our lives, and try to follow these laws of nature, we have happiness. We have harmony within ourselves. We have harmony between ourselves and all that which is around us. And then finally, we have harmony between ourselves and that which is our source, what is called God. This is the idea in the smallest nutshell of what is Dharma. So this is one of the important foundations of Sanatana Dharma. Another one is philosophical, and that is that we have the ability to understand the nature of ourselves, the nature of our world, the nature of the absolute, of that which is our source, and the relationship between all three of these things in a reasonable and rational way. See, this is what's interesting, is that unfortunately today, again, in modernity, in 2019, almost 2020, in just a few months, what do we tend to find among people who have quote-unquote belief systems? Well, they tend to veer, unfortunately, between two extreme poles. Either on the one hand, they are individuals who believe that there is no such thing as truth, that truth is something that is alterable, that truth is something that is subjective, that essentially, because we all have different opinions, therefore we all have our own truths, which there is that is not a logical conclusion to come to. But essentially you have those individuals who say that, truth is not really something that you can really grasp fully. That's one pole. On the complete other side, what we see are individuals who are blind fanatics. We see fundamentalists. We see fanatics of every stripe, whether political fanatics, religious fanatics. We have individuals who they have their dogma and they believe in it, and it doesn't matter if it's not rational. They have blind faith in that. So what we tend to see today is, again, one pole versus another pole. Well, what Sanatana Dharma offers philosophically is a rejection of both poles. And rather the idea that, no, there is indeed truth. Truth is indeed absolute. Truth is indeed objective. Truth is indeed something that is knowable. But it's not a matter of blindly believing simply some doctrine. It is a matter of truth is something which, if it is indeed true, it can withstand our intellectual pursuit of it, and an open intellectual pursuit of that truth. So again, this is what Sanatana Dharma offers. It offers, yes, a teaching that is the most ancient teaching on earth, but at the same time, something that is truly philosophical in the full meaning of that term. That is, rational, intellectual, something that can be discussed, and something that can be explained through reason. And a rejection of both of those poles. There are several other elements of Sanatana Dharma that are crucial. Because in addition to the philosophical, there's also practice. You see, if a person wishes to be truly spiritual, being a philosopher is not enough. Being an intellectual is not enough. And this is something that Sanatana Dharma also teaches us. That if we are to be truly spiritual, what we need is a perfect coming together of the philosophical, but also practice as well. Spirituality is something, in other words, that is meant to be lived, not just thought. It's not just an idea. It's not just something to be debated. It's not simply a matter of, oh, let's do a comparison of religio-philosophical ideas and concepts. No, spirituality is something to be lived. Indeed, how do you know if an individual is truly spiritual? It's not merely by what they say. It's by what they do. And in fact, let me give you the greatest of secrets. Truthfully, it's not even a matter merely of what they do. It's a matter of what they are. This is how you truly know if an individual is truly spiritual, especially a spiritually advanced being. So this is something also that Sanatana Dharma provides us. It provides us a practical path that we can follow in order to, again, not just think our way to truth, but to manifest that truth in a living, experiential way in our own lives. Thus, what do we have in Sanatana Dharma, in the Vedic way? Well, we have meditation, we have yoga, we have sadhana, what is called sadhana. And these are the various spiritual practices that have been carried down to us for generation upon generation upon generation, which if we follow these practices, we can begin to, quite literally in our own lives, experience the divine. Experience who we are as Atman, as eternal souls, but also to then experience God in a very direct way. And this is the ultimate goal, and this is something else that Sanatana Dharma provides us. Now, having said all this, what is unfortunate is that, again, all of this was known at one time. All of this was known at one time in the ancient world. And when I say the ancient world, of course, I'm not talking about merely India. None of us are Indian. This has nothing to do with India. This has to do with, again, eternal wisdom, eternal knowledge. And all of this was known at one time. This was known not just to ancient Indians, but to the Chinese, to the Japanese. This was known to the Greco-Romans. This was known to the ancient Germanic people, to the Slavic people, to the Celtic people. This, what I just described, this worldview and these practices were known to people throughout the length and breadth of the entire earth at one time. But it became lost. It became lost. For so many reasons that are so complex, it would just take too much time to go into that at this point. But there is an entire historical explanation for why this great knowledge became lost, especially to the Western world, very unfortunately. Well, one of the blessings, and maybe the only blessing, of the 20th century was that finally this knowledge was reintroduced into the Western world. And for this reason, indeed, we have to be very thankful to our Indian cousins, our cousins from India, who kept this knowledge alive for so long, and who, beginning really in the late 19th century, but throughout the 20th century, various great gurus and swamis began coming to America, to Europe, to the rest of the world, and reintroducing this knowledge that we ourselves once had, but then lost. Well, of all the various great gurus who came to the Western world, without exception, and I truly mean this because I know the history of this almost more intimately than anyone. I know at least the names of every single Indian Swami and Guru who came to America for the last 150 years, starting from Vivekananda. Without exception, the greatest Guru to come to the West was Abhaya Charanara Vinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj, Prabhupada. He was truly unique, and he was the purest representative of authentic and traditional Vedic culture to ever set foot in America. To say he was an astounding individual would not even do justice to explaining how great Prabhupada was. He was an individual who, again, while other gurus had come previous to him, and certainly even while he was alive, different gurus were coming to America and Europe, and certainly even to this day, many are still coming. None of them matched Prabhupada in several senses. In the sense of purity, of authenticity, of fidelity to Sanatana Dharma itself. You see, it's inevitable. One could almost argue, I wouldn't, but one could almost argue that it's inevitable that if a person were to come from India and try to teach Sanatana Dharma in the Western world, well, of necessity, they would have to water it down. Philosophically, as far as the practices, as far as the ethical principles, and most of them did. Actually, all of them did, with the exception of Prabhupada. When Prabhupada came to the Western world, indeed, his mission, his goal was to present pure and authentic Vedic culture, to quote him, as it is, without alteration, without watering down, without compromise. And again, up until Prabhupada and to this very day, no other Indian guru or Swami ever accomplished this other than Prabhupada. I want to talk just a little bit briefly about who Prabhupada is. And again, why it is that he was so great and what are some of the things that he did. Well, first of all, Prabhupada was born in 1896 and he left us finally in November of 1977. He himself was a remarkable individual. He himself was a person who was born a Vaishnava. He was born in what's called a Vaishnava family. That is, his family, they were devotees of Krishna, of Vishnu, of Narayana. So he was literally born in this tradition. And early in his life, while he was still a very pious individual, his interest in spirituality was not as strong as it was to become. And what was the catalyst in his life spiritually was meeting his guru, his personal guru, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura. And this was in 1922. And it is a very interesting story that I love to tell. Everyone who's listening to me now, I know you've all heard this story, but still, it's crucial. Because this is what changed his life, was when he was a college student. And in 1922, he had a friend of his who persuaded him to come meet this guru, who he had met himself a little while ago. And that was Bhaktisiddhanta. And at first, Prabhupada was a little bit skeptical. He wasn't very interested, but still, his friend persuaded him. So he went along with his friend, and he met this person. And this great guru, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, was on the veranda, on top, on the roof of his temple in Calcutta. And as soon as they met, the first thing that came out of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's mouth was, so you understand English well? And Prabhupada said, oh well, yes, I can speak English. And immediately, without hesitation, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, having just met him, quite literally having just met him, said to Prabhupada, this is very good, you understand English. Now, you should go to the Western world and teach them about Krishna. They need to know about Krishna. The Western world has become materialistic and atheistic, and they are plummeting themselves and our world toward doom. And they don't know it. And the only thing that can save our world is if we go to the West and teach them about Krishna, and about what it means to be a Vaishnava, a devotee of Krishna. Quite literally, they had just met. And yet he's saying this to Prabhupada. Well, needless to say, this conversation changed Prabhupada's life. And just a few years after that, he ended up taking initiation from this great guru, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, who himself finally passed away in very early 1937. Well, at this point, Prabhupada's guru had passed away. And yet, this seed that his guru planted in Prabhupada's mind and heart was there and grew. And Prabhupada understood, yes, I need to do this. Somehow or other, I need to fulfill my guru's mission. Well, he spent the next several decades trying, struggling. He started a magazine, Back to Godhead magazine. He wrote several books. He did speeches, he did talks, he did kirtans. He tried throughout the length and breadth of India to fulfill his guru's mission. No one was interested. At least very few people seriously listened. But yet, Prabhupada did not give up. Finally, to make a long story, very long story, but a beautiful story, very short, finally in 1965, Prabhupada had the opportunity to go to the West, to come to America. Because a supporter of his, who owned a steamship company, gave him passage on a steamship to come to America, the Jaladutta. And interestingly, this person, this woman who had the steamship company, begged Prabhupada not to go. Because at this point, Prabhupada was 69 years old in 1965. Very elderly, quite elderly. And yet here he is. He wants to leave India for the first time in his life, go to the West on a steamship. And this woman warned him, oh, please don't go. But Prabhupada insisted, no, this is my mission, I will go. And on that steamship, he went. And it was a perilous trip across the Atlantic Ocean, where they met storm after storm, and it was very difficult. And Prabhupada, who had never been on a boat in his life, he had never been on anything like this, a boat or an airplane, he became very ill to the point where he had a heart attack on the boat on the way to America. And he recovered a little bit. And then he had another heart attack. Quite literally 2 heart attacks on his way to America. It was during this time that something truly astounding, something truly amazing happened with Prabhupada. And that is, Prabhupada, up until that point, obviously, was already extremely surrendered to his guru's order and to Krishna. Obviously, this is why he spent so many years trying and trying to teach. But something happened on that boat when he had those 2 heart attacks and he realized that he was facing death. And that is, at that point, he truly, like at no other time in his life, turned to Krishna and surrendered his entire being to Krishna. Basically saying to Krishna, please, you are the master. Simply make me your puppet. You are the puppeteer. Just please make me do what is your will. I am here only to serve you. And he wrote some beautiful prayers in Bengali to this effect. And for those of us who are followers of Prabhupada, we firmly believe that it was at that point in 1965, when he was on this boat, that he went from being merely a normal human being to what we call an Avesha avatar, an individual who was so fully surrendered to the will of God that in human form, essentially, if you met Prabhupada, what you would be meeting was the will of God personified and the grace of God personified. This is what Prabhupada was. And again, especially starting in 1965. Well, when he came to America, again, to make a long story short, he had radical success. Within the next 12 years of his life, he began a movement that changed really the face of the world. Interestingly, unknown to most people, he really did change the face of the world for the next 12 years of his life until he finally left in 1977. And there are several things that Prabhupada introduced to the Western world that were not here really before him. And again, any follower of Vedic spirituality, they don't have to be a follower of Prabhupada. They can be a follower of whatever Swami, whatever sect, whatever Sampradaya, whatever Vedic school of thought is in the Western world, of any yoga system. They can be a follower of Kriya Yoga, Raja Yoga. It doesn't matter. Any individual in the West today owes a debt of gratitude to Prabhupada because he introduced many things that they are now doing that didn't really exist in America before him. Let me tell you some of these things. First of all, authentic Vedic philosophy. People didn't really understand Vedic philosophy per se in its unadulterated form before him. Well, he introduced this in the strictest of ways. What are the traditional Vedic philosophies of Vedic spirituality? Several other things. Bhakti Yoga. Bhakti Yoga was a term that people had heard of in the West before Prabhupada, but there was no systematic practice of Bhakti Yoga in the Western world previous to Prabhupada. Prabhupada truly introduced Bhakti Yoga as a philosophical and practical system to the West, and it didn't exist here before then. Another thing that Prabhupada introduced that has become very prevalent now among Vedic and yogic circles, kirtan. Today, if you are a yogi, if you follow any kind of Vedic spirituality, you know what kirtan is. So many yoga centers today have kirtan. There are famous kirtan, let's say, musicians and leaders, and you can go and buy dozens and hundreds of different kirtan CDs now. People are literally making money on kirtan. What's interesting? Kirtan did not exist in the West before Prabhupada. It did not exist before Prabhupada. Prabhupada was the individual who introduced the very practice of kirtan to the West. This is a historical fact. Beginning in 1965, when he began doing kirtan publicly. First in upstate New York, but then in 1966 on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So this is another thing. Murti worship, the worship of deities, of God in deity form, in Murti form, and doing so very strictly. This did not exist in Europe, in America, among any Vedic practitioners. They didn't know what statues of Krishna were. They didn't understand what murtis were, the science of murti worship, murti meditation, etc. Another extremely important thing that Prabhupada introduced to the Western world, and that is the Brahminical tradition and Brahminical initiation. Now, again, I know the history of, let's say, Hinduism in America and the West probably better than anyone. I quite literally have a PhD in religious studies, and I've studied this all of my life. And I could be wrong about this. There might be some instance that I have never read of or heard of in my life. But to my knowledge, not one guru has ever given authentic Brahminical initiation to a Westerner previous to Prabhupada. That is, literally giving Brahminical threads. You know, for those of us who are Brahmanas, who have Brahmana initiation, we wear a thread. I have one on right now that never leaves my body. This did not exist before Prabhupada. Prabhupada introduced one of the most ancient practices in the Vedic tradition to the Western world for the first time. But again, not merely Brahminical initiation, but the Brahminical tradition, what it means to live as a Brahmana. So this is something else he introduced. The practice of yajna. Again, there may have been a few individuals, maybe before Prabhupada, who did yajna, that is, sacred fire ceremony. But probably not very many. Prabhupada institutionalized this in the West, where Prabhupada disciples, followers of Prabhupada, we all understand the central importance of doing yajna, of doing this very ancient fire ceremony. Again, this was something that was introduced by him. The Varnashram system, and this is something that I could go on about for many, many hours, but I'm not going to, just due to lack of time. But the idea of Varna and Ashrama is something that Westerners, a few Westerners had heard about this, but no one truly grasped this concept in its entirety before Prabhupada came here. And especially the idea that Varnashram system is something that can be reestablished. People in the West didn't really grasp this before 1965, when Prabhupada came to America and began talking about this. Now, this is a short list. Truthfully, I can talk about probably at least several dozen other things that Prabhupada was the first guru, the first Vedic guru to introduce to the Western world. These are only a few, very short list, and maybe some of the more important ones. But again, the debt of gratitude that we owe to him is enormous, is amazing. If I can, let me just tell a very personal story about Prabhupada. And I may be wrong, but I don't believe I've ever actually said this on a video recording before, or at least one that's been released to the public. But I want to tell my own personal story with Prabhupada. And that is, I saw Prabhupada myself in 1976 when I was 13 years old. I can't say I met him. We didn't speak or anything like that. But I actually saw Prabhupada when I was living in New York, because for myself, I was born and raised in New York City, and I lived there until I was about 24 years old, after which I moved to the Midwest of America. But when I was approximately 13 years old or so, at that point, I had already been practicing Vedic spirituality for several years, for maybe about 3 years previous to that. I had read the Bhagavad Gita. At that point, I had read many, many books on yoga, Vedic spirituality, etc. Interestingly, I had not read any of Prabhupada's books at all. In fact, I barely even knew who he was at that time when I was 13. But I was doing meditation, I was practicing yoga, I was vegetarian. I had been vegetarian for about a year, I believe, or so. And when I was 13, I found myself walking through the streets of Manhattan by myself. That was something that I often did, was just take walks. And I was walking through the streets of Manhattan, and I remember I was walking north, so I was walking uptown in Manhattan, and as I was walking, I began to hear this very thunderous sound, this very thunderous noise. And I, at first, wasn't sure what the sound was, but as I kept walking, I saw in front of me that on the next street corner, there were a bunch of people who were just standing there looking down the street, and I couldn't see yet what was happening. But the sound kept getting louder and louder and louder. And it was reverberating literally on all of the skyscrapers of Manhattan. And then finally I got to the corner and I looked and I realized, oh, that's Kirtan. Yeah, I've heard about Kirtan. In fact, I had heard Kirtan a few times before. And I looked down the street, and this was West 55th Street. And down the street, I don't know, maybe 200 feet away or so, there were what seemed like hundreds of people, of Hare Krishna devotees. And they were having a thunderous kirtan. They had what I would later learn were these drums called mridangam. And it seemed like there were a dozen of them. And they had dozens and dozens of karatalas, including large ones. And they were jumping up and down and all singing. And it was so loud that it was literally like thunder. And I am standing there. I'm standing there on the corner just staring at this. And there are maybe a few dozen other people, just very normal people, some business people. And they're staring. And without taking my eyes off of this, I kind of leaned toward another man who's standing there. I remember he looked very nice. He was in a suit. And I just leaned to him and I said, what's happening there? And he did the same thing. He didn't take his eyes off of this kirtan. He just leaned to me and he said, oh, it's the Hare Krishnas. Their guru just arrived. He's in that car. And all I remember was me saying, and it wasn't even to this man. I was almost just saying it to myself. Really? And at that moment, the door of that car opened, and here comes Prabhupada, who I later learned was Prabhupada, and he comes out of the car. And this was the thing that was amazing. He took one step, and this kirtan that was so loud that it was like thunder stopped immediately. And all these people hit the ground and offered their obeisances. And I remember the only person still standing with his head high, I remember that, was Prabhupada. And he just looked around, and I know he looked in my direction because I still wonder to this day if I made eye contact with him. But he looked toward my direction, he just looked all around, and he walked into the building. And everyone immediately stood up again, and again was the thunderous kirtan, and they followed him in. And that was Prabhupada. That was 1976 in New York. And this is just a very personal aside, that to this day, I was 13 back then and I'm 56 now. To this day, one of my only regrets in my life, certainly my biggest regret, is that I didn't walk up to that temple and follow them in and get to literally meet Prabhupada. I didn't have that opportunity because I just didn't know what to do. I was stunned. I was spiritually, quite literally stunned. I felt like I couldn't move. I felt like I was not even in my body anymore, seeing this person. That was Prabhupada. And very sadly, a little bit more than a year after that, he was to leave this world. He left this world a little bit more than a year after that. And thankfully, his vision was continued by the person who ended up becoming my guru, Bhakti Rakshaka Sridhar Swami. His vision was continued after Prabhupada left this planet in 1977 by his great godbrother, Sridhar Maharaj, Sridhar Swami. And in 1985, I went to Navadvip, to India. I took initiation from this great guru. In 1986, I went back, took Brahmana initiation, also from Bhakti Rakshaka Sridhar Swami. Well, he himself, sadly, was to leave this world in 1988. But, this is something that I have told people in the past, that in 1986, when I was in India, in Navadvip, at our Gurudeva's ashram, I had this truly wondrous, very personal experience with my Gurudeva, and that is that I had just arrived in his ashram in Navadvip in 1986. I think it was maybe October or something like that. I forget the exact month. But soon after I had arrived at his ashram, and I literally put my bags down, his secretary at the time, who I believe was Badri Narayana, I think that was his secretary, he came to me and he said, Prabhu, Gurudev wants to meet with you. He heard you just got here. And I was astounded that he even knew who I was. I mean, he had given me initiation, but, I was very shy and very, very humble back then, and I was surprised that my guru even knew I had arrived. But his secretary came and said, "Oh yes, Gurudev wants to speak with you." So he took me to the building where my guru was. We went upstairs to the veranda area, and there he was, sitting there by himself. And Badri Narayan took me, and I offered my obeisances, and I sat, and I was there like maybe 4 feet away from Gurudev. And at that point, I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe he was maybe blind in one eye, had difficulty seeing out of the other, his hearing was not very good. So I had to sit very close to him. But he began speaking to me, and he asked me, back then my name was Prana Krishna Das. And he said, so you're Prana Krishna Das? And I said, oh yes, Gurudev. And you've come from America? And I said, yes, Gurudev. I just arrived. Yes, I just arrived a little while ago and just got here, and I came from America. New York? I said, yes, that's right, I'm from New York. Very good. Very good. And then he started to say, that is so wonderful. You've come from so far. That is so wonderful. So you've come from so far. You've come from America to learn about Krishna, correct? And I said, yes, Gurudev. Yes, I'm here. Yes, I am here to learn from you. I'm here because I want to know Krishna. I want to know everything about Krishna. I want to have devotion to Krishna, and that is why I'm here with you. And he, again, just said, very good. That is very, very good. And then he was quiet for a short time. And then he looked me in the eyes. And he said to me, in the same way that you have come here to learn from your guru about Krishna, now you must go back to America and teach them about Krishna. Now you must be a guru. You have come here to learn from your guru, now you be guru. You go back to America, you teach them about Krishna. You be Acharya, Like I am Acharya, you go back and you teach them. And the same experience that I had when I saw Prabhupada happened again. I was just stunned. I couldn't say anything. And he kept going on, and he spoke to me just alone, the two of us, for about 10 minutes or so, maybe 15. And after a while, for those of you who were with my Guru, you know this, as soon as other disciples hear, oh, Gurudev is talking, they start to go there. So one by one, other people started to come. And then finally there are like, 15, 20 people there. And then at that point, he began just talking to everyone in general. He just ended up giving a talk. But that stuck with me. That he, for some reason, wanted me to be there with him, and he said that to me. And it haunted me. And again, I keep repeating this, to make a long story short, that's why I began teaching in 1988, when our Gurudev left the planet. And this is my personal goal. In the same way that Prabhupada was haunted at first by this order from his Guru, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. Those who know me well know that I also spent the first several years, maybe this first decade or two, one could say, somewhat haunted by the words of my Guru about what to do. What does this mean? Why did he tell me this to now become a Guru in America and teach people? And this was the final realization that I had, getting back to Prabhupada. All of the great things that Prabhupada did were truly amazing. Again, all of the things that he introduced into the West as a spiritual teacher, as a guru, as an acharya. But there's one other thing about Prabhupada that made him different from every other guru that I have not mentioned up till now, and purposefully, and that is this. His vision was not merely to teach people spirituality, not merely to teach them the science of self-realization and of God consciousness. But this is the greatness of Prabhupada. His vision was so great and so expansive that his idea was indeed to change the totality of the world, to quite literally recreate a Vedic civilization in our world, the likes of which we have not seen for hundreds if not thousands of years, really I would argue since the last Yuga. Prabhupada came to the West not just as a spiritual teacher, but as someone who wanted us to understand that Vedic spirituality, this tradition that I call Sanatana Dharma, this phenomenon, this force that I call Sanatana Dharma, can teach us how to quite literally reform politics, economics, culture itself, everything. Prabhupada's vision was, again, a total vision of transforming society, certainly spiritually, and spiritually as its foundation. But his idea also, and we see this from his teachings, from his writings, from his lectures, he had this vision that, no, we need to affect politics, economics, culture, science, aesthetics, with the idea of indeed creating not just a spiritual movement, but a spiritual civilization upon the face of the earth. This is one thing that made Prabhupada radically different from other gurus, but it's also, sadly, something which, since Prabhupada left the planet in 1977, has not been fulfilled. Well, for myself personally, I see myself as having this mission first and foremost in my life, and that is to fulfill this vision that Prabhupada had of indeed creating a golden age in this world today, to reestablish truly a Vedic civilization along with everything that that means. And this is the thing, indeed, it was Prabhupada himself who predicted and who told us that we are indeed going to experience a mini golden age within this context of the Kali Yuga that will last for 10,000 years. It's Prabhupada who first gave us this vision. That yes, as bad as things are in this Kali Yuga, in this current age, and things are bad, things are worse than actually the vast majority of human beings know. If people actually knew the full depths to how bad things are, they would almost be paralyzed with fear. They would be stunned. Things are bad today. But despite that, Prabhupada told us we are going to establish a mini golden age within the context of even this darkness. And it will be an era of light. It will be an era of peace, of prosperity, of goodness, of true culture, true beauty, true meaning that will last for 10,000 years. And I see it as my personal mission, certainly to teach spiritually what Prabhupada taught us, that is pure Vaishnava Dharma, devotion to Bhagavan Sri Krishna. But at the same time, also, we are meant to truly, practically establish a Vedic civilization, a golden age. We are meant to do this now, not in 1,000 years. We're meant to do this immediately. We're meant to do this practically. We are meant to establish, quite literally, a civilization in our lifetime that will reflect Dharma in this world. So this is my mission. This is what I have been attempting to do for the last several decades now. This is why we put out our videos. This is why we have our books that we have put out. This is why we have this organization called the International Sanatana Dharma Society. That is our mission, and we are determined to do so. And we will not fail in this mission. But this is why we do what we do. This is why I'm speaking to you today through this medium in Croatia. And this is my appeal to you. Please help me in every and any way that you can. So with that, I will stop there. This talk, as is always the case, is it not always the case? It went on a little bit longer than I said it would. But I will stop there. And thank you again very much for your indulgence, for your patience, for giving me this opportunity to speak with you. And if you want to unmute now, please feel free. And if anyone has any questions, comments, please feel free.
Okay, so you were, in the beginning, you were talking about mental illnesses, anxiety, depression, and suffering in general. So why is this happening and how to actually heal it? So what are the main steps, like concrete steps to heal this issue and this suffering? Because especially in my generation, I was born in 1997, and I can tell that these mental illnesses have become great problem in my generation. So what is the issue about it, and how can we heal that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is indeed something that has grown tremendously in the last several decades, and exponentially and increasingly. I mean, certainly there's always been mental illness, no matter what the generation, but what we've seen is especially in recent days. And when we say mental illness, what we mean is, yes, indeed, internal suffering, internal depression, etc. Well, this is due to a combination of things. Of course, there are internal factors that may be there. There is indeed a genetic component, let's say, to especially depression and different sorts of mental illness. That's always the case. But what we have seen is that the non-genetic contributors to depression have grown tremendously. This is due more than anything to existential reasons. That is, again, if we are raised in a society that is the opposite of the sort of society that we're meant to be raised in as human beings, this will be a natural occurrence. You see, we are meant to be raised in societies in which, yes, we have meaning, we have structure, we have order, there are institutions, there are ideas that we can rely upon. In other words, we have religion. We have religion as a foundation to our life that gives our life meaning and purpose and structure. We have faith in God. We understand that we are not alone. More, this spirituality is then, let's say, translated socially in the idea of community, in the idea that, yes, we have not just families, but strong families, families in which, yes, the parents are individuals who are very virtuous, very ethical, and they try to teach their children by example. And then greater than that, we have the community itself, the neighborhood, the society, the nation, in which people feel that they are a part of something greater than themselves. Well, what has happened in the late 20th and again 21st century? All that has been deconstructed. So what we see is that we are living in a society of radical secular materialism, one in which, of course, if an individual, this is the attitude of politicians. Oh yes, if some individual wants to bother with religion, we'll leave them alone. But as far as religion and God and spirituality itself, it is absent from the public square. It's something that is not considered to be of importance anymore. As a result of that, what's happened? Well, we see this in America especially, but I'm sure it's beginning to affect Croatia as well and other nations in Europe. As a result of the absence of spirituality, the family has collapsed. We find individuals where, yes, we see individual families where, yes, the parents are not very strict. The parents themselves are not very good examples. The children see this. They start to rebel. All the individuals of the family begin to become just that, individuals, rather than seeing themselves as a unit, as a family. We see that even in a nation, the idea of nationhood, that I am part of a greater community, I am part of a civil structure where I must do my best because it helps my fellow citizens and they do things to help me. We see that that's collapsed. As borders especially have collapsed throughout the length and breadth of Europe, and even being a nationality doesn't have meaning anymore. What does it mean to be German? Well, anybody can be German now. Doesn't matter who you are, what your origin is, what you look like, etc. What does it mean to be British? What does it mean to be anything? You see, when the idea of society itself begins to collapse, and you no longer feel that you are part of something greater than yourself, what happens? You feel isolated, you withdraw, you go deep within, but in a bad way, not in a spiritual way. You withdraw of necessity, and what begins to happen is you feel alone. And this leads to depression and mental illness. Again, the non-genetic component. This is why so many people today, and especially younger people, especially let's say people under 30 today, are miserable. Young people today are miserable more than any other generation in history. And again, it's because they feel disconnected. They feel disconnected, they feel alone, and as a result, they feel hopeless. So yes, this is what is causing this sense of disconnection and loneliness, being alone. Now, having said all that, as far as what the causes of mental illness are today, you can see what the solution is to this, what the actual cure is. And it is a reversal of this, bringing things back to a natural order, bringing things back to Dharma. The way that we can combat mental illness is first and foremost by those individuals who do find themselves depressed, feeling that their life is hopeless, meaningless, without value, without purpose, etc., gaining all of that, gaining some purpose and meaning by turning to the eternal, by turning to those values that are indeed eternal and based upon something real and authentic. So by becoming spiritual again, and more, not just philosophically, but also beginning to practice those very powerful practices, those sadhanas of spirituality that will then begin to rejuvenate them spiritually, that will begin to bring light to their minds, peace and comfort to their hearts. What is that? Meditation, and specifically meditation upon the names of God. When people begin to practice, again, communing with God by meditating upon the names of God, what begins to happen? Now, internally, you begin to have that clarity of vision again. You don't feel alone anymore. You feel as if, and you know this, you experience the fact that God is present there within you, and you don't feel alone anymore. What begins to happen at that point? The depression begins to lift like a dark cloud that was hovering over our heads. It begins to lift. We begin to see the light again. We're no longer depressed. We're no longer feeling hopeless. And we now have purpose again. That purpose being to serve God with everything that we can and to rebuild our connections with others. See, this is what's unfortunate. This severing of connections that I described, that so many individuals today have experienced. Again, the family breaking down, the idea of nation being meaningless now, community being meaningless. This severing of connections that we feel, and thus feeling very alone now, this was done on purpose. This was done on purpose, again, by evil individuals who have ruled and controlled our various societies for so very long, by corrupt politicians, corrupt, truly degenerate cultural leaders, spiritual leaders who have been compromised, etc. This was done on purpose, this severing of ourselves from everyone around us. Well, now we need to repair all of this, and we need to reconnect with those who are around us, and we do this spiritually. When we do this, again, mentally, emotionally, we will begin to be healed in every way. So does that answer your question somewhat?
Okay, so I have one more question. Can
Please.
you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Why giving offerings and abundant things to deities, and why are we worshiping them? So why wouldn't we transfer this energy to people around us?
Good, very good question. And again, I'm just going to lower your volume a little bit again. Yes, that is a very good question, actually. This is the reason why. People have very often asked this question in different ways. Yes, why should we devote all of our energies to worshiping God, to giving offerings to God, rather than just helping all those who are around us? You know, instead of offering some incense to God, oh, that money that we paid for that little bit of incense, we should have given that to the poor instead, etc. And again, people have asked this question actually for a very long time, for hundreds of years, in fact. And this is the answer. Several things. First of all, we need to understand that while charity, that is helping those who are around us, is indeed something that is crucial, and truthfully, spiritual people help those around them more than anyone else. This is the thing that's always fascinating to me. Whenever someone asks me this question, and I'm not saying this is a reflection of you, I'm talking about people in the past, often I would have like an atheist, for example, very often like a Marxist, say things to me like this. Oh, instead of wasting your time and money on religion, you should just help those around you. This is the thing that I always have to point out to them, and you can look at the research. Study after study after study has shown that, interestingly, the people who give more in charity to the poor, to those in need around them, more than anyone, are religious people, are spiritual people. Rather, the people who are atheists tend to do the least. That's the thing that's almost hilarious about this. The people who are atheists and say, oh, don't waste your time and money on religion, instead help those around you. Again, study after study have shown that those people actually do the least themselves. So interestingly, it is being spiritual that gives you the impetus to help others. Because if you're not a spiritual person, then what does that mean? Well, you tend to be a little bit more self-centered, and a person will talk a lot about, oh, we should help other people around us, but they tend to do the least. Rather, when you believe in God and when you are a spiritual person, that is what gives you the compassion necessary to help others. So that's the first thing that I have to say. But then on a deeper philosophical level, this is why it is of crucial importance to give to God. First of all, let me preface this by saying this. We know that God needs nothing. We know that God does not need our offerings, whether we offer, again, some incense or water, or we offer food on the altar, etc. God does not need any of these things. Why do we offer these things? This is the reason why. First of all, we do these things as a sadhana, again, as a spiritual practice to help ourselves. When we do offerings to God, what we are doing is, indeed, we are practicing, actually, giving. This is what we're doing. what it means to be an individual who is in illusion, which means the vast majority of people in the world, is that, again, we tend to think about our own needs only. But when we are doing puja or we're doing some sort of offering to God, we are now practicing giving to someone else. And not just someone else, but to God. You see, what greater person to be very giving toward the rest of humanity than someone who is practiced at giving of themselves, and especially to God. So this is the thing. Again, in giving, it's almost like a practicing. When we are giving to God, now the idea of giving becomes easy to us, and now we can give to others as well. But then metaphysically, this is also very important to understand. God is indeed the center of all reality. And when we give to God, it is especially when we give to God, and thus we increase, let's say, the spiritual experience of those of ourselves and those who are around us, what ends up happening is everybody benefits. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, it gives this very nice example that anyone, who is a follower of Prabhupada, you've heard this a million times, that if you have a massive tree, you can try to take water to every individual leaf, every twig, every branch of the tree, and water all of those individual leaves in that way. But what will happen? That doesn't work. The leaves will die, and you'll waste your time. Rather, you go to the root. You give that water to the root, and what happens? By putting the water and the nourishment in that one place, the entire tree thrives. So in the same way, God is the root of all of existence. It is when we give to God that then everyone thrives spiritually. And if you're thriving spiritually, it's guaranteed you will also thrive materially as well, because spirit is greater than matter. So this is why we do offerings. And again, those individuals who do offerings tend to be the people who help others more than anyone, rather than the people who do no offerings to God, who are not spiritual. They're the ones who talk about, we should help humanity. But again, study after study, statistic after statistic, in many multiple nations, and I know because I did the research, I've seen these studies, the people who are not very religious, they tend to give less. They give the least to other individuals. So does that answer your question?
Okay, yes, thank you. And then my last question is, how do we know which quote unquote religion is the true one? Because everyone is claiming that they have the truth.
Good, very good. I'll answer this first in a very simple way, but then I'll go a little bit in depth. One way that you know which religion is the greatest religion, the best religion, the true religion, is first of all, look at that religion that transcends all religion. That's the first thing. Look at that religion which transcends the idea of religion itself. See, this is the thing, and I understand what you mean by the question. The idea of sectarianism, the idea that we have today. See, it's unfortunate. It's very easy for people to get lost in their current time and to think that things have always been the way that things are now. When we think about religion, what do we tend to think of today? Yes, we tend to think of what are called the great world religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, a few of the smaller ones maybe, Sikhism, Jainism, Shinto, etc. And what we tend to think is that this idea of, my sect versus your sect versus someone else's sect, and these religions contending with each other and competing with each other, we tend to think that, it must have always been this way. It must always have been the case that for as long as there have been humans on the planet, we've had the situation of different religions competing with each other. The truth of the matter is that's not true. This has only been the case in roughly the last, let's say, 2,500 years or so, something like that. Previous to this, the truth of the matter is all of the various religions of the world had more in common with one another than things that distinguished them from each other. And more, the things that did distinguish various religions from each other were more cultural and linguistic rather than as far as belief system. So the truth of the matter is this very idea of sectarianism is indeed very recent. Again, maybe 2,500 years, 2,600 or so. So this is a very recent thing. Rather, what people really followed in the ancient, truly ancient world, and I'm talking about 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, they followed Dharma. There really was one spiritual worldview that united the vast majority of the world. And that was indeed Dharma. Again, it was expressed differently culturally, linguistically. But as far as the belief system, it was pretty much the exact same thing. So this is a very recent thing. Now, all that being said, this is another principle of logic that I have repeated several times that people have kind of lost sight of, and that is this. Simply because you have different people all claiming that they have the truth and they're all saying different things, that doesn't mean that there is not a truth to be known. And again, I've given this example many, many times. You go into a room of 5 people and you have a question, simple question. 1 + 1 equals what? And let's say person 1 will say, oh, it equals 17. Another person, oh, it equals 1 + 1, oh, it equals 0. Another person will say, oh, 1 + 1, it equals a rhinoceros, and they'll all give different answers, and every single answer is wrong. Now, this is the question. If they all give the wrong answer, does that mean that there isn't an answer, that there isn't an actual right answer? You see, of course, we know there is a right answer. It doesn't matter if people know the right answer or not. It doesn't matter if everyone gets it wrong. There is a right answer nonetheless. So what does this show us? Very simply, it shows us that there is the realm of opinion, but then there is the realm of truth. And the two have really nothing to do with each other. So this is how we make this distinction. Sectarianism, that is, oh, my religion is right versus my religion is right, that's the world of opinion. That's like the 5 people in that room who all got the answer wrong. Whereas actual truth is the actual answer. 1 + 1 equals not a rhinoceros. 1 + 1 equals not 0. 1 + 1 equals not 17. 1 + 1 equals 2. That is the answer. It is a truth, it is an answer that transcends mere opinion alone, mere speculation alone. Thus, this is what we are aiming toward. To the point where it doesn't even matter what we call it. You see, I call it Sanatana Dharma only because that's the most ancient name. This is in the Sanskrit language, so it's appropriate to call it by its most ancient term. But the truth is, this path that we have been describing really has been called many, many, many hundreds of different things, different words, different names in different languages, but it's the same thing nonetheless. Again, to come back to this example, 1 + 1 equals 2. Now, you can say that sentence in Croatian. A person can say that sentence in French. A person can say that sentence in Arabic. A person can say that sentence in Russian. A person can say that sentence in, and on and on. And it doesn't matter how they say it, it is a truth nonetheless. 1 + 1 does equal 2. You see? So in the same way, Dharma is something that transcends sectarianism. It is as logical and as truthful as is mathematics and logic. So this is why we follow Dharma, not because we have this blind belief that, oh, my religion is better than others. No. We actually don't care about religion even per se. We care about truth. And in the same way that true philosophy must transcend different kinds of worldly opinions, mathematics must transcend worldly speculation. In the same way, truth is truth, and it doesn't matter what you call it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
This question we have. So we have just two more questions.
Please, feel free.
Namaste, Acharya-ji, can you hear me?
Yes, namaste.
My name is Induleka, spiritual name, and I have a question regarding Gaudiya Vaishnavism, because most of us here are practitioners of that path. But I see one of the problems in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. It seems that there is a strict difference between what is called material and what is called spiritual. Like the precedence is giving only to the spirituality. So, like, everything what is material is wrong, and it should be neglected in some way. So, can you explain a bit about this issue that we all find pretty often in Gaudiya Vaishnavism?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, that's something I would love to address, actually. We know that if you look at Vedic culture is a culture that stresses the importance of having spirituality in the center of your being, while at the same time, materially, living comfortably. There's no way around this. All we have to do is read the scriptures. And we see that people, spiritual people, Vedic kings, rishis, yogis, different people who just lived in normal society but who were very spiritual, they had the best of everything. They had wonderful food, they had comforts, they had beautiful homes. They stressed beauty in their lives. So what does that mean? It means that in their architecture, in their paintings, sculptures, etc., they had beauty everywhere. They appreciated gold and silver. They appreciated beautiful jewelry and rubies and diamonds and all these things. We also understand that truly Vedic people lived full lives. What does that mean? It means that in accordance with the ashrama system, when you're very young, you're a brahmachari, brahmacharini, yes, you live a more ascetic kind of life, which is natural. Whatever society you're in, when you're younger, yes, you're a student, you're learning, you're growing, you have to be strict with yourself, etc. You don't have quite as much freedom. But then what happens? Well, eventually you leave that stage. You become a grihasta, a householder. And then it comes to the point where, of course, you get married, you have children, you have all the comforts of life. But then much later in life, again, you go into ascetic stage. But in that in-between stage, you are meant to enjoy life to its fullest, spiritually, yes, not hedonistically, not to the extreme. And there are certain virtues that you must follow all throughout your life. But still, this, let's say, artificial war between the spiritual and the so-called material, that was not there in Vedic culture whatsoever. In fact, on the contrary, now philosophically, we understand also that as Vaishnavas, we follow the Bhagavad Gita. And what is one of the primary themes of Bhagavad Gita? What does Krishna tell us? Krishna tells us to fully engage in the material world. Do your duty. Follow your occupation in your proper ashram, regardless of what that is. Do it well, do it in a detached manner, and spiritualize it. So, of course, Arjuna, as we know, wanted to artificially renounce the world. And what does Krishna say to him? This is the first time I read the Bhagavad Gita, I was 10 years old. And this was something that amazed me because I had my own little conceptions of what it meant to be a yogi. And yes, I had this idea at 10 years old that, oh yes, a yogi, you just live in a cave and you have nothing and you barely have clothing and you live as a radical ascetic. And I read the Bhagavad Gita when I was 10 years old for the first time. And here's Krishna, and he's telling Arjuna, no, don't do that. Rather, you're a warrior, be a warrior. Be a good warrior. Do your duty, but focus on me. Externally, be in this material world, doing your duty. You see, this is the thing that's amazing about Bhagavad Gita. It's a perfect book because it shows these extremes. See, Arjuna wasn't a cobbler. He wasn't a carpenter. What was he? He was a warrior about to face materially one of the most extreme situations imaginable. He's about to engage in a war and kill people and maybe himself be killed. And what does Krishna say to him? Do it. Yes, fully throw yourself materially into this insanity of war, where all your senses are going to be assaulted, but focus on me. focus on me internally. Externally, do your duty. Internally, focus on me. This is what Krishna says. So philosophically, we understand that we can engage in the material world, again, in a reasonable way, not with hedonism. And we have to be strict about this. Yeah, there are some things you must avoid if you're a spiritual person. But then there are other things that you can enjoy if you're a spiritual person. So this is why, like with my disciples, for example, yeah, we tend to avoid this silly external sort of asceticism. So with my disciples, like with the men, none of them have shaved heads. They all live in the world. They have jobs. They do normal things. Some are married, some are not, etc. They dress, for the most part, very normally. A few of my disciples will wear kurtas. I have a few women who they wear saris, but for the most part, they dress very normally. And they have real lives in the real world, but internally, they're spiritual. Internally, they have spiritual values, and they practice their sadhana, and philosophically, they understand what is the meaning of life, etc., and they are developing their devotion to Krishna. So this is the thing that's of importance. What we're meant to do is externally do things in the world, internally be spiritual. Instead of that, we want what is true Vedic culture, and that is externally, yes, you're in the world, you do what you have to. You have a job, you do your job, you do it well. You have to work, Monday to Friday or whatever. You're a student, you have to study. Oh, make sure you study, make sure you get straight A's. You see, don't use spirituality as an excuse to not do well materially. But externally, you are in the world, but internally, you are focused on Krishna at all times. That's the message of the Bhagavad Gita. So yes, for a truly spiritual person, there's no war between the material and the spiritual. On the contrary, they do what Krishna and Prabhupada said. You spiritualize the material. You don't hate the material. If we hated the material, I shouldn't be speaking to you right now because we're using the material. I'm using a computer, we're using Skype. I'm being filmed with a very nice video camera, etc. We have recording devices all around me. If we were at war with the material, I wouldn't be speaking to you right now and conveying the spiritual. So yes, we need to have a healthy balance. This is what's important, a healthy balance between the two. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
My pleasure. This is the thing. This is how we save the world. This is how we save the world. We save the world by ourselves understanding truth, but then taking that truth and then very gently sharing it with others. Because this is what I was saying earlier. There is a great awakening that's happening where people are yearning for spirituality. And they may know nothing, or they may be attracted to something wishy-washy, something a little bit more new age, where there isn't anything there. Well, we have the ability to help these people. Let's very gently guide them. You see, this is why we have Guru Kripa. This is why we have the grace of Guru, is so that we can gently help people wherever we find them. Some people, like we were saying, we'll find some people who they're depressed and they just need meaning, they need help. We'll find some people who they're more philosophical. We'll find some people who, yes, they want spiritual experience. We need to go to people where they are, where we find them, whatever they're experiencing right then, and just gently help them, bring them in the right direction. And that's it. And this is something I always have to remind my disciples also when we're teaching. We always have to remember this important principle. You cannot save everyone. So in other words, don't get frustrated when, you find a nice person and you try to teach them and they seem to be listening for a little while, but then they lose interest or they go in a different direction. Never allow such things to discourage you. Because again, we cannot save everyone. We just try. We just try like doctors. Let's say you're a surgeon and you're a very good surgeon, but once in a while you'll lose a patient. Does that mean that you stop being a surgeon? No. No, you understand that you can't save everyone. You just do your best. But you continue to try and try and try. And we never, ever, ever give up. And this way, we save the world. We save the world. we save the world.
Thank you, Acharyaji, for your wonderful talk and for answering all of our questions. I hope we will meet again in a short period, and we are all very thankful for your time and patience.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you so much again for organizing this. Thank you for all coming together. And yes, this will grow and grow, and I will be happy to speak to you again at some point in the future. All right, take care, everyone. Namaste. Jai Shriman Narayana. Jai Bhagavan Shri Krishna. Jai Radhe. Jai Prabhupada. Jai Gurudeva.